sharing my time with the member from Mégantic-L'Arabe. So, what we are debating today is a motion put forward by the Bloc Québécois to affirm that the House of Commons, or that the House of Commons is calling upon the government to ensure that we don't have an election. So this is the motion that we're debating today. And for those that are watching who maybe don't follow Parliament all the time, I think it's important for people to understand that we are in a minority Parliament situation right now. And what that means is that no party has an absolute majority of seats in the House of Commons. So in theory, because we're in a minority parliament, the government has to work with other political parties to get support for its legislation. Now, you'll remember that the Liberal Party had a majority from 2015 through 2019, and then they lost that majority in the 2019 election. And during that 4-year period when they were in government and had a majority, they were very used to just ramming things through the House of Commons, not really working with any opposition party, also having control of parliamentary committees. And for those who may not know what parliamentary committees are groups of members of parliament that have specific mandates to review legislation, to review different topics, and they're very important to the functioning of parliament. Now, again, just to explain the finer points of how parliament works, it is every member of parliament responsibility to hold the government to account. And what I mean by the government, of course, the executive branch, the cabinet. Of course, there are members of parliament who hold positions in the executive. But if you do not hold a government appointment, it's actually your job to question the government, to say, is this in the best interest of the Canadian people? Could we do something better? Is this the best path forward? Why are we doing this? That's actually the job of parliament. That type of a dialogue leads to good public policy, but under the Liberal government, we don't see that happening. They got accustomed under their majority years to just whipping their backbench, to not having any sort of debate and moving forward. And I would just say this, I've now been in opposition for several years. I fully take my responsibility to hold the government to account very seriously. I vigorously question the government about their policies. I review legislation to see whether or not it's in the best interests of my constituents. I do use parliamentary committee to get answers. I use parliamentary procedure to do that. And that's what every parliamentarian should be doing. So back to this motion today. The Liberal minister who's responsible for this just gave about a 30-minute speech with a bunch of almost Orwellian language that if what he was talking about came to pass, Parliament really wouldn't function at all. So let's talk about the first talking point the Liberals are using today. So they're saying, well, everybody wants an election because opposition parties might vote against legislation. It's confidence. Well, if the government is putting forward bad legislation, or there's parts of the legislation that the opposition doesn't agree with, it's actually, again, going back to what our role is as parliamentarians, to not support it. The government has to earn my vote. And they should have to earn the vote of every member of their backbench, not just accept it or expect it through a whip or the threat of a party nomination. And so that talking point is so egregiously bad. It just, for somebody who was the former government House leader to put that forward, I mean, it's come on, it's shameful, right? So let's not expect that. But let's talk again about this minority situation. The government does have to work with opposition parties right now. They have to earn the support on confidence matters of another minority or another party so that the legislation can pass. The Liberals don't want to do this, right? Of course they don't want to do this. They don't want to have to negotiate with the Bloc Québécois, with the Liberals, or with the Conservatives, or the Greens. They don't want to do that. So what do they want to do? They want to go back to the polls in order to get a majority government. And that's really what anytime anybody hears speculation about an election during a pandemic, it's because that's what the government wants to do. Now, the Liberal minister that's in charge of this file was just asked point blank, by a colleague in the Bloc Québécois, can you confirm that the government does not want an election? And in typical Liberal form, danced around that question and didn't answer. And again, I think it is fair, as the Bloc Québécois have pointed out today, that the Liberals have put forward a bill. For those who are watching, it's called Bill C-19. It significantly changes the Election Act, and they use something called time allocation. That means that they limited debate on this bill because they want to push it through prior to the summer. And a lot of pundits, a lot of people are saying this is because the Prime Minister wants to trigger an election. And this has nothing to do with a confidence vote in the House of Commons. A lot of the speculation has been made in media and with pundits. The Prime Minister, it wouldn't be about a confidence vote in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister would, I would say, go to the Governor General, but he kind of messed that one up too, and call an election. So that's really what's at stake here. So when you hear Liberals using talking points today about this, it's completely bunk. But let's talk about an election in a pandemic. I can tell you what people in my constituency want right now, Madam Speaker. They want hope and they want a way forward. I have been very pleased to be the opposition health critic since September. And I am very proud of the fact that I have used every tool at my disposal to force the government to get answers on vaccine procurement, on rapid test procurement. I mean, I'll never forget a moment in Health Committee where Pfizer said, you know what, no, the government hadn't negotiated vaccine delivery of our vaccine until the end of February. They only came back to us in November to renegotiate a contract to get a few doses in December. And why? It's because Parliament put political pressure on the government to ensure that vaccines were available for Canadians. And that's where, the work I did, I know that my colleague, I think the sponsor of this motion today is actually my colleague from the Bloc Québécois who sits on the Health Committee with me. That's where Parliament works, is when the government is not doing what it needs to do. Other members of Parliament use procedure in order to force the government to do the right thing or consider a different option. And this might not be convenient for the Liberal government. I understand that. But that is how our democracy works. And when you see the scope of things that the government have done, like prorogation, they actually shut down Parliament. The other talking point today the Liberals are using is like, well, the opposition needs to work collaboratively with committees. That's whenever you hear a Liberal say work collaboratively, it means don't ask questions, shut up, and just vote the way that we want you to. And that's unfortunately not for them, not how Parliament works, but fortunate for the Canadian public. The last thing is in committees. If a Liberal gets up today and says, oh, well, committees aren't functioning, it's really been the Liberal Party that have filibustered committee every time. I have sat through so many filibusters on Health Committee in a pandemic, on motions that have provided information for the Canadian public, that have brought ministers to committee, that have generated news stories so that the Canadians can actually say, hey, wait, maybe this isn't going well. Maybe we deserve better. And that, in turn, that political pressure forces the government to act. But to be clear, an election right now, we're, what is it, 3% of Canadians, only 3% of Canadians are fully vaccinated. You see the United Kingdom opening up, the United States. I saw yesterday that the governor of California, a Democratic governor, or a very Democratic state, is lifting their mask restrictions in the middle of June because of their forward progress on vaccination. And Canada is just not anywhere near there. The federal government hasn't even provided any benchmarks for what vaccinated persons can do in this country. And there's a lot of people who are watching this today who are saying enough is enough. I demand safety. I demand health. I demand the right to work. I demand the right to see my family. I demand the right and the freedom of movement. This has been well over a year now where my freedoms and my safety have been questioned, and the federal government has not delivered on any of these things. So, that is why the Liberal government wants an election. They want an election because they don't want those voices to punch through and to demand better. But I can tell you on behalf of every opposition person here, even though we might disagree across party lines, Bloc Québécois, NDP, Green, on different items of policy, we can all agree that this government needs to do better on the pandemic. And that's what they need to be focusing on. And you know what? I don't think any of us are going to apologize for the work that we do to get answers for Canadians. I sure don't. That's why my constituents pay my salary, to fight, to ask the tough questions, and to be a champion for these things. So if Justin Trudeau wants to go to our non-existent Governor General and trigger an election, he'll have to answer for that. But for now, Madam Speaker, what we're going to continue to focus on is getting a way forward through the pandemic.
So I do have before I go to questions and comments, I have a point of order from the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Well, the member just used the full name of the Prime Minister within the last 20 seconds. I just thought you might want to address that.
Yes, it's a matter that we've addressed this morning earlier with a previous speaker, so I would just ask all members to ensure that they refrain from using the first or last name of parliamentarians, ministers, or the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There, continually, in my opinion, misinformation that's being spread, in particular by the Conservatives and Bloc Québécois as it relates to C-19. And this member did it herself when she said that this piece of legislation intends to significantly change the way that people vote in Canada. And that's not what this legislation does. The Chief Electoral Officer came forward and said back in the fall, I need a plan in case there's an election during a pandemic. Can you please ensure that we have one? And this was a response to that. But more importantly, both in the preamble and in Clause 11 is address the fact that this is only temporary measures to deal with an election if a pandemic is called. Will the member at least admit that that is the case and that this is that the bill calls only for this to be temporary measures?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, Madam Speaker, number one, the member opposite that just asked the question is a perfect example for people who are watching of members that don't question the government, that just repeat talking points and get up in the House of Commons with scripted questions on behalf of the government. And that doesn't really serve his constituents. The second point is that the member talked about a bill for an election during a pandemic. There's only one party that's talking about an election during a pandemic, and it's the Liberal Party of Canada.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yesterday, our leader proposed that there may be consensus sought with all parties so that time allocation not be applied. Does the member's party agree with this position?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I love a good debate in the House of Commons. I think that anybody watching this, even the Liberals, would agree with that. I think it's very important that government legislation is given due scrutiny in every instance. I also think that it's important for government backbenchers to scrutinize what's coming out of their cabinet, which we really haven't seen happen. So, when I see, the Liberals giving away speaking spots in debate because they can't find backbenchers to debate, I really think it shows sort of a disintegration of what Parliament could and should be. So yes, of course, I support vigorous debate of government legislation.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for, just a minute there, that's escaping me for a second. The Honourable Member for Cowichan Malahat, no, sorry. For Askina Bulkley Valley, that's the one.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you to the member for Calgary-Nose Hill for her remarks. There were certainly lots in there that I agreed with, particularly the importance of the opposition holding the government to account and the need for the government to avoid obstructing the work of Parliament. My question is this: we find ourselves in a funny place, and does the member for Calgary-Nose Hill not agree that as long as we're in a pandemic and as long as the Prime Minister has the discretion to precipitate an election, we should do the responsible thing and ensure that there are election rules in place that protect Canadians as per the request of the chief elections officer?
The honourable member Calgary-Nose Hill.
Actually have some very good friends in the members' riding. One owns a tattoo shop and one owns a hair studio. And I think what they want him to be focusing on is a plan to get vaccines into the community and to get the government to have benchmarks so that they can fully work and realize the potential of the community, as well as ensure that their businesses survive.
For a brief question, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for an amazing speech, as always. And, I thought she made a very good point about how, the government today is trying to shame the opposition for holding the government to account. How many times did you vote against, a confidence motion when the government has failed to actually work with other parties to come with legislation that's good for Canadians? Would the member like to comment on that?
Brief answer from the member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
I always feel like the liberal members try to beat me. That's what they want to do. Like, they just want to own me somehow, when in fact they should realize that in Parliament I am a formidable opponent because I will always champion the rights of my constituents and their interests. I've never seen in my time under the Prime Minister's government, this Prime Minister's government, the Liberal Party seek to work across party lines in any meaningful way. I want to give a shout out to my former colleague Megan Leslie, who was my opposition critic when I was in government, and we always tried to do something that resembled work. Unfortunately for Canadians, the Liberal government, I think, really have lost this capacity, and I think lost the respect of Parliament because of it.